The Ravencroft family had always been a shadowy legend among the living. Their dynasty stretched back to the early centuries, their legacy painted in blood and secrecy. But in the heart of the sprawling metropolis of Blackfall City, their presence was no longer whispered in fear. It was challenged. Seraphina Ravencroft, the matriarch, sat at the head of a long mahogany table in their Gothic high-rise penthouse. Her obsidian hair, streaked with hints of silver, cascaded over her shoulder like molten night. Her piercing eyes scanned the room, taking in her children, each a force of nature in their own right. There was Victor, the brooding eldest, whose loyalty had always been her anchor. Lila, the cunning diplomat who navigated mortal politics with terrifying ease. And Adrian, the youngest and most unpredictable, whose defiance burned like wildfire. They had gathered to confront a grim truth. One of their own had betrayed them. "The Lycans knew of our safe house." Seraphina's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "They slaughtered our coven. Someone told them where to strike." Adrian slammed his fist on the table, shattering the delicate glass tumbler before him. "You think it's one of us?" He snarled, his amber eyes glowing faintly. Victor's steady gaze didn't waver. "It's not about what we think. It's about what they know. If the Lycans have gained the upper hand, it's because we allowed it." Lila leaned back in her chair, a sly smile playing on her lips. "Let's not rule out the possibility of external factors," she said, her tone light but her words weighted. "We've made enemies among mortals as well, and their technology grows more dangerous every day." But Seraphina was unmoved by speculation. She stood, her presence commanding even as silence fell over the room again. "No, this betrayal is blood-bound, and we will root it out, no matter the cost." Unbeknownst to them all, Adrian's wild heart hid a secret. A chance encounter with a Lycan, a moment of weakness that had spiraled out of control. The guilt gnawed at him, but so did the temptation. Could he be the one responsible for the unraveling of his family's power? And if so, could he face their wrath? The Ravencroft family was no stranger to treachery. Long before they rose to power in Blackfall City, their lineage had been tested by fire and blood. Seraphina often found herself gazing out of the floor-to-ceiling windows of their penthouse, watching the city lights flicker like dying embers. It was a constant reminder of how fragile power could be, and how quickly it could be stolen. In the aftermath of the attack on their safe house, Seraphina moved swiftly. "Lila," she ordered, her voice sharp. "Gather intelligence on the Lycans' movements. Victor, assemble a team. We need to send a message that will remind them why the Ravencrofts are feared." Adrian lingered in the shadows, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. His mind raced with conflicting thoughts. He hadn't meant to betray his family. Not fully. The Lycan he had met, Kyle, had saved him once during a chance encounter in the city's underbelly. What had started as a reluctant truce had grown into something deeper, a dangerous bond that neither of them could fully understand. Adrian knew that if the truth came out, it would destroy him. But as he looked at Seraphina's cold, calculating expression, he wondered if she would even hesitate to cast him aside. Meanwhile, Victor had already begun assembling their forces. The Ravencroft family didn't just rely on their supernatural strength. They had alliances with mortal power players, politicians, business moguls, and even mercenaries who owed them favors. As Victor worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that the enemy was closer than they realized. He had always been wary of Adrian's impulsive nature, but he couldn't bring himself to believe his brother capable of betrayal. Lila, ever the strategist, took a different approach. She infiltrated a high society gala, where she knew Lycans had been spotted before. Her sharp wit and charm allowed her to blend seamlessly into the crowd. As she gathered information, she overheard whispers of a secret alliance, one that could shift the balance of power in the city. But before she could dig deeper, she felt a presence behind her. "Enjoying the party?" a low voice murmured. Lila turned to find herself face to face with a tall, silver-haired man with piercing blue eyes. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You must be one of the Ravencrofts. I've heard so much about you." Lila's heart raced, but her expression remained calm. "And you are?" "Someone who knows the value of secrets," he replied cryptically. "Perhaps we could trade." Back at the Ravencroft penthouse, Seraphina stood before a vast map of Blackfall City, its streets and districts marked with crimson pins representing their strongholds, and now black ones for those lost to the Lycans. The air was tense as Victor returned with reports from their allies. "Our contacts in the mortal world are growing restless," Victor said, his voice low but steady. "They sense weakness after the safe house attack. If we don't act soon, we'll lose more than territory." Seraphina's gaze didn't waver. "We act when we are ready. Fear is a weapon, Victor. Let them feel its sting before we remind them why they serve us." Meanwhile, Adrian paced the room like a caged predator. Every mention of the Lycans sent a shiver of guilt through him. He had to find Cale. He needed answers, needed to know if the Lycans had acted on his slip or if there was another traitor in their midst. Slipping away from the others, he descended into the labyrinthine streets of Blackfall City, where shadows thrived and secrets lingered. Adrian met Cale in the ruins of an old cathedral on the edge of the city. Moonlight filtered through the broken stained glass, casting fractured colors on the stone floor. Cale leaned against a crumbling pillar, his silver hair catching the light. "You look troubled, Ravencroft," Cale said, his voice calm but edged with curiosity. Adrian's fists clenched. "The Lycans attacked our safe house. They knew exactly where to strike. What did you do?" Cale raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "You think I betrayed you? That I'd risk our arrangement for petty revenge?" "Then who did?" Adrian demanded. "Someone's feeding them information, and if it wasn't you, maybe it's closer to home than you think." Kyle interrupted, his tone sharp. "You vampires have your own share of secrets, don't you? What if this betrayal isn't about the Lycans at all?" Adrian's mind spun. Could it be possible? Could one of his own family members be the true architect of their downfall? The thought made his blood run cold. At the gala, Lila played her role flawlessly, mingling with politicians and elites, her sharp mind piecing together fragments of conversation. The silver-haired man who had approached her was named Alaric, a human, or so he claimed. But there was something off about him, something too perceptive. "Tell me," Alaric said, his voice smooth. "Do the Ravencrofts always send their best to do their dirty work? Or are you simply here because you enjoy the game?" Lila's smile didn't falter. "And what game would that be, Mr. Alaric?" "The one where alliances are made and broken," he replied. "I hear whispers, Ms. Ravencroft, whispers of power shifting, of secrets coming to light. And I wonder, what would your family do to protect theirs?" Before Lila could respond, the lights dimmed, and a piercing howl echoed through the venue. Panic erupted as Lycans crashed through the windows, their forms shifting in the dim light. Lila barely had time to react before Alaric grabbed her arm, pulling her to safety. "Looks like your family isn't the only one with enemies," he said with a sly grin. As chaos unfolded around them, Lila's mind raced. Who was Alaric, really? And why did it feel like he knew more about the attack Then he was letting on. Adrian returned to the penthouse under the cover of night, the weight of Cale's words heavy on his mind. Could there truly be betrayal within the family? Not just an external threat, but a shadow hiding among their own? The thought made his stomach churn. But as he stepped into the familiar gloom of their home, he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't tell Serafina what he'd learned. Not yet. Meanwhile, Serafina stood in her private chambers, gazing at the ancient tome she had retrieved from the vault beneath the penthouse. The book, bound in cracked leather and inscribed with runes older than the city itself, was a relic of the Ravencroft bloodline. Inside, she searched for clues, a weapon, a spell, anything that could shift the tide of their conflict. The tome had protected their ancestors in times of peril, and now it called to her once more. Her solitude was broken by Victor, who entered without knocking. "The lichens are mobilizing," he said bluntly. "We've spotted their movements in the northern districts. They're not hiding anymore." Serafina closed the book with a soft thud. "They're trying to provoke us." Victor nodded. "And it's working. Our allies are growing impatient. They want blood, Serafina." "And they shall have it," she replied, her tone icy. "But only on our terms." Lila, shaken by the attack at the gala, returned to the penthouse with more questions than answers. Alaric's cryptic warnings lingered in her mind, and she couldn't shake the feeling that he knew far more than he let on. Who was he really? And why had he helped her, instead of joining the lichens? She confronted Serafina, her voice edged with frustration. "Mother, we need to talk. There's something you're not telling us." Serafina's gaze was unwavering. "What makes you think I owe you every secret, Lila?" "Because we're being hunted," Lila shot back. "And because I spoke to someone tonight who knows more about this attack than we do. Alaric. He's not just some human caught in the crossfire. He knows something, and I intend to find out what." Serafina's expression darkened. "Alaric? That name should have died centuries ago." Lila's heart skipped a beat. "You know him?" There are few things in this world older than the Ravencroft bloodline," Serafina said carefully. "Alaric is one of them. If he's resurfaced, it means we are in far greater danger than I realized." Adrian, still haunted by his encounter with Kael, found himself drawn to the cathedral once again. But this time, he wasn't alone. Lila had followed him, her curiosity piqued by his erratic behavior. "You're hiding something, Adrian," she said, stepping out from the shadows. "And I'm going to find out what." Adrian glared at her. "Stay out of this, Lila. You have no idea what's at stake. Don't I?" she countered. "We're all in this together, Adrian. Whatever you're doing, whatever you're hiding, it's going to tear us apart." Before Adrian could respond, a low growl echoed through the cathedral. Kael emerged from the darkness, his presence commanding. "So the siblings meet at last," he said with a wry smile. "This should be interesting." Lila's eyes widened. "You're working with a lichen?" she hissed, her voice dripping with fury. Adrian stepped in front of Kael, his posture defensive. "It's not what you think, Lila." "It never is," she snapped. "You've put us all in danger, Adrian. Do you realize what you've done?" Kyle raised a hand, his expression calm. "Enough. If you two want to survive what's coming, you'll need to work together. The lichens aren't your only enemies." Kyle's words hung in the air, and for the first time, Lila hesitated. Adrian had always been reckless, but she couldn't deny the raw fear in his eyes now. There was more at play here than she had realized. "What do you mean?" The Lycans aren't our only enemies? Lila demanded, narrowing her eyes at Cale. Cale leaned against a broken pew, his expression unreadable. This city's balance of power is built on a lie. The Ravencrofts and Lycans. We're just pawns in a much older game, and someone's ready to rewrite the rules. Adrian frowned. Who? The mortal factions? They've always been too divided to pose a real threat. Cale shook his head. Not mortals. Something older. Something you've forgotten. His gaze shifted to Leela. Ask your matriarch about the Pact. The Pact? Lila echoed, her confusion giving way to a cold sense of dread. She didn't like how Cale said it, as if it was a ghost from their past that had risen to haunt them. Ask her, Kyle repeated. But you won't like the answers. Back at the penthouse, Lila confronted Seraphina with Cale's cryptic warning. The matriarch was seated in her study, the ancient tome still open before her. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows across her face, making her look more like a statue than a person. What is the Pact? Lila demanded, slamming the door behind her. Seraphina's eyes flicked up, calm but piercing. Where did you hear that name? Does it matter? Lila shot back. What does it mean, Mother? What aren't you telling us? For the first time in centuries, Seraphina looked uncertain. She rose slowly, her movements deliberate, and turned to face her daughter fully. The Pact, she said, her voice measured, was an agreement forged long before you were born. It kept peace between the supernatural factions in this city, vampires, Lycans, witches, and others you've only read about in bedtime stories. It was a fragile truce, but it held until now. What happened? Lila pressed. Seraphina's gaze hardened. The Lycans broke it. Or so I thought. If there's truth to what you've heard, then someone has been working behind the scenes to shatter the Pact entirely. Lila's mind raced. And if the Pact is broken? Then war, Seraphina said simply. Not just with the Lycans, but with everything that lurks in the shadows of this city, and we won't survive it. Meanwhile, Adrian returned to the cathedral, this time alone. He couldn't shake the feeling that Cale knew far more than he was letting on. If the Ravencrofts were to survive, Adrian needed to understand the full scope of the threat they were facing. Kyle was waiting for him, his arms crossed as he leaned against the altar. Back so soon? I'm flattered. Cut the sarcasm, Adrian said, his tone sharp. You know something about the Pact, something you're not telling me. Cale tilted his head, studying Adrian with a mix of amusement and curiosity. Why should I tell you anything? You're the one who's been lying to your family, remember? Adrian's fists clenched, but he forced himself to stay calm. Because if you don't, we're all dead. Lycans, vampires, everyone. Whatever's coming, it won't stop with us. Kyle sighed, running a hand through his silver hair. Fine, but you're not going to like what you hear. He stepped closer, his voice low and serious. The Pact wasn't just a truce. It was a binding spell, woven by the witches to keep the city's darkest forces at bay. If it's been broken, then those forces are waking up. And trust me, Adrian, they're not interested in playing nice. Adrian's blood ran cold. And you think my family has something to do with this? I think your family has everything to do with this, Cale said. The Ravencrofts were the ones who sealed the Pact in the first place. And now, it's unraveling. In the depths of the Ravencroft penthouse, Seraphina convened an emergency meeting of her children. The air was thick with tension, as Adrian and Lila stood on opposite sides of the room, their unspoken conflict simmering. Victor, ever the steady presence, leaned against the wall, his arms crossed as he observed the chaos brewing beneath the surface. "Enough secrecy," Serafina declared, her voice commanding. "The Pact is broken, and with it, the barrier that protected this city from the forces lurking beyond. We cannot waste time on blame or hesitation. We must prepare for war." Lila stepped forward, her eyes sharp. "And who's to blame for the Pact's unraveling, Mother? You've always kept us in the dark about its origins." Serafina's jaw tightened. The Pact was forged to keep balance, not to share with children too young to understand its weight. "That's not good enough," Adrian interjected, his tone bitter. "The Lycans are mobilizing, and now you're telling us there's something worse coming. We deserve to know the truth." Serafina hesitated, a rare crack in her icy demeanor. "The Ravencrofts were tasked with enforcing the Pact," she admitted, her voice low. "It was our duty to ensure the truce remained intact, to keep the city safe. But one family cannot shoulder such a burden forever. Something went wrong. The spell unraveled, and now the old powers are waking." Victor frowned. "Old powers?" Serafina nodded. "Witches, demons, spirits bound by the Pact's magic. They've been dormant for centuries, but with the barrier gone, they will rise, and they will seek vengeance." The room fell silent, the weight of Serafina's revelation sinking in. The Ravencrofts had always been powerful, but now they faced enemies beyond their comprehension.